She married the broke drifter who slept in her barn. He owned half of New Mexico. I want to tell you something about a woman who didn't know what she was marrying. And I mean that as the finest thing I have ever said about anybody. The barn smelled like old hay and horse sweat, and the particular kind of cold that settles in wood at 4 in the morning. I'd been sleeping in that barn for 11 days when she came in with a lantern and found me not sleeping at all, just sitting against the stall boards with my knees up and my hat over my face, listening to her mares breathing the way you do when your own mind won't stop. She didn't startle. That was the first thing I noticed. A woman alone on her property walks into her barn before first light and finds a man she'd hired for day wages sitting up awake, and she doesn't flinch. She just moved the lantern a little to see me better and said, "Can't sleep either." Not a question, a fact she was offering. I said no, I couldn't. She hung the lantern on the nail by the feed room and went to check on the mare. Didn't say anything else for a while. The mare was close to foaling, and Delia, that was her name, Delia Crane, she'd been up checking on her every few hours for 3 nights running. I know because I'd heard her boots on the barn floor each time and laid still, not wanting to spook her. I said, "She's not ready yet, maybe 2 more days." Delia looked at me over the mare's back. "You know horses." "Some." She accepted that, went back to running her hand along the mare's flank. After a while she said, "My father used to sleep out here when she was close to foaling too, drove my mother crazy." I didn't say anything to that. "He died in March," she said, not asking for condolences, just stating a fact, same way she'd stated I couldn't sleep. "I know," I said, "people in town mentioned it." People in town mention a lot of things. That was all we said that night. She took her lantern and went back to the house. I sat there until gray light started coming under the barn door, and then I got up and started the morning chores without being asked. I need to tell you what I was doing there, and why I wasn't who I appeared to be. My name is Walker Bain. I own, or owned, the structure of it has changed some since then, 4 ranches across eastern New Mexico. 200,000 acres between them, a small cattle operation that had grown steadily for 20 years, mineral rights on about 30,000 of those acres that had started producing something worth having about 8 years prior. I am not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you because for the better part of 3 years before I arrived at Delia Crane's property, every woman who'd come within arm's reach of me had known exactly what I was worth, and every one of them had been drawn not to me, but to that number. My foreman's wife put it plainly once, as women sometimes will. She said, "Walker, you are not an ugly man and you are not a stupid man, but you have got a cloud following you, and the cloud has a dollar sign on it, and that is what women see." She wasn't wrong. I'd had a long engagement that ended when the woman in question, decent enough woman, I think in her way, started asking more questions about the mineral rights than she ever asked about me. She'd wanted to know about the lease structure, wanted to understand the legal arrangement between the land and the company that was pulling ore out of it. And when I explained it to her, she listened with her head tilted slightly to the left the way people do when they're doing arithmetic. I don't hold it against her. She was practical, but a man knows when he's being assessed rather than regarded. A man always knows. After the engagement, I'd had 2 years of what I can only describe as polite predation. Invitations to dinner from women whose fathers needed financing, smiles across rooms from women who'd done their arithmetic. Twice I'd thought something might be real, and twice the same deflation. A conversation that revealed the number was the draw, not the man holding it. One of those women was lovely, actually, kind in the small, everyday ways, and I think she'd have been a good wife to someone. But I watched her face the afternoon I told her I was thinking about restructuring part of the operation, and might take a significant loss for a year or 2. And I watched the calculation cross her eyes before she'd managed to rearrange her expression, and that was that. I don't say any of this with bitterness, it's just how it was. The last straw, if there was one, was a Cattle Buyers Association dinner in Las Vegas, New Mexico, not the other one, though sometimes people need that clarified. February, a year before I turned up in Delia's barn. There was a woman there, someone's daughter visiting from Denver, and she was sharp and funny, and she laughed at things in a way that meant she found them funny, not because she was being gracious. We talked for 2 hours. I thought, maybe this one is real. On the ride home that night, her father pulled up alongside my wagon and told me what a fine girl she was and what prospects she had, and how a man who'd done what I'd done with the land. Because of course he knew, they all knew, well, a man like that and a girl like her, that was a partnership worth considering. Partnership. I drove home and sat on my porch and looked at the sky for a while. The sky in New Mexico at night is not modest. It's just stacked up there in all directions with no end to it, and it has a way of putting things in proportion. I decided I was going to leave. Not permanently. I told Archie Flood, man who'd been my foreman for 15 years and who knew the operation the way a man knows his own kitchen, that I was taking 2 months, and I was taking them without a name attached. I said I needed to go be a person instead of a balance sheet for a while, and I wasn't sure how else to do that except to stop being Walker Bain, known quantity, and be nobody in particular for a spell. Archie chewed on that. Archie was not a man who chewed on things for long. He said, "That's the most expensive vacation I've ever heard of." I said it wasn't about vacation. He said, "I know, I'm saying it's still expensive. What do I tell people when they come looking?" I said, "Tell them I'm traveling on business." He said that was almost true. He thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I was, but the kind where you're still thinking clearly, you just can't do what you've been doing anymore without running into the wall. I'd run into the wall. I needed to go be somewhere else for a while, as someone else, and find out if there was still a version of me that existed outside of the acreage and the mineral rights and the careful conversations at dinners where everybody knew the number. I left on a Thursday. Took a horse I'd owned for 6 years, not the one I'd have ridden to a meeting, the older one I'd have ridden to check a fence. Took $30 in wages, the same as any hand would have. Left the good coat, took the worn one, didn't shave for 2 weeks. I worked a horse operation in Mora County first, good people up there, and they hired me without ceremony, and I ate at their table and fixed their equipment and slept in their bunkhouse, and nobody knew my name beyond Walker. And it was, I don't know how to say this without sounding like a man having a breakdown. It was like being cold water after being boiled. Just quiet. Just being nobody and doing useful work. Then a fence outfit near Cimarron, 2 weeks. Then I drifted south again, following work the way you do, and came into Henley on a gray Tuesday with a week of road on me and $12 in my pocket. And at the feed store, a man named Gaskell, who was old enough that he didn't bother with preambles, said there was a widow woman trying to run the Crane place alone, and she might take on a day laborer if the day laborer wasn't worthless. I said I'd go find out. He looked me up and down, said, "You look reasonably not worthless." I thanked him for the reference and rode out. The Crane place was 7 miles from town, which is close enough for comfort and far enough that trouble doesn't wander out casually. The house was sound. I noticed that first, the way a man who's put a lot of work into structures notices how they're holding. The barn was older but tight. The fencing along the road was in good repair except one stretch that had slumped and not yet been got to. Delia Crane came out of the house before I'd fully stopped. That was another thing I noticed early. She didn't wait for things to come to her. She met things. She had dark hair pulled back simple, a work shirt, boots that had seen years of use. She wasn't imposing, but she had a way of standing that used all of her height. She looked at me the way you look at something you need to evaluate in a hurry, and you know it. She said, "Gaskell send you." I said he'd mentioned she might have work. She said, "What can you do?" I said horses, fencing, equipment, general ranch work. She said, "Can you fix a windmill?" I said some experience, yes. She took me out to look at the one giving trouble. I had it running in 40 minutes. She watched me the whole time without saying a word, not breathing down my neck but not walking away either, and when it started turning again, she nodded once. A single short nod the way you acknowledge a thing has been done correctly, and said, "Room and board and $2 a day." I said that was fine. She showed me the barn, showed me the bunk, said dinner was at 6 and she didn't abide lateness. Said her 2 hands were Cal, older man, steady, and Ferris, who was young but learning. Said the mare was close to foaling and needed watching. Said the east fence along the creek needed attention, and could I get to it this week? I said yes. She went back to the house. That was the interview, the whole of it. I unsaddled my horse and brushed him down and looked around the barn and thought, this is a tight operation run by someone who knows what they're doing. And then I went and found the east fence. Delia Crane was 34 years old, which I learned later. She had dark hair going gray at the temples, not from age, but from a year of carrying more than one person ought to carry. Her father had built the ranch from nothing, according to what Cal told me over the first few weeks, and had run it tight right up until March when his heart gave out somewhere between the house and the barn. He'd gone out to do something in the morning and hadn't come back, and Delia had found him in the yard. Cal told me this in a matter-of-fact way, the way ranchmen talk about death, which is to say he told me the facts of it without decoration. He said the old man had left her the land and a debt to a bank in Santa Fe that wasn't going to kill her but needed watching, and 2 good men, and not enough of them. And that pile of problems was what she'd been running with since March. He said, "She's managing it." I said I could see that. He said, "Don't underestimate her. She looks like she's holding by a thread, but the thread's made of wire." That was an accurate assessment. She ran the operation the way certain people run things when they've learned from someone who knew what they were doing and then internalized it so deep it became instinct. She had a system for everything. Feed measurements, rotation schedule for the pastures, accounting that she did herself in a ledger at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings. I saw the ledger once from across the room, and the columns were tight and clear. Her father had taught her. She also worked as hard as either of her men, not performing it, not making sure anyone saw, just working, first one up, last one done. I saw her take a job that wanted 2 people to do it safely and do it herself without complaint because both her hands were occupied with something more pressing, and she did it correctly, taking the extra time to compensate for having only 2 hands rather than 4. That kind of practical adaptation in the field, that's not something you fake. That's a person who's spent years learning their land. I noticed other things too, the way you notice when you're paying attention and not filling up the space with noise. She was alone in a way that had gone past loneliness into something quieter. Not unhappy, exactly. Not performing contentment either. Just settled into the shape of a life that didn't include being known. Cal and Ferris respected her, genuinely, not because she made them, but because she'd earned it a piece at a time. But respecting a person and knowing them aren't the same thing, and she'd learned to live in that gap. I recognized it because I'd been living in a version of it myself. Mine came from money. Hers came from being a woman running a ranch in a county that hadn't decided yet what to make of that. But the shape of the gap was similar. People who appreciated what you could do, people who worked alongside you, people who didn't actually see you. Dinner the first week was mostly quiet. Delia sat at the head of the table, Cal and Ferris on one side, me on the other, and conversation was about work, what needed doing, what had been done, anything to plan for. She asked clean questions and listened to the answers and made decisions without dithering. If one of her men had a better idea, she took it without ceremony. I watched Cal offer a different approach to the creek fencing on the 3rd day and watched her consider it for about 4 seconds and say, "Do it your way, then." And that was the end of it. I didn't contribute much those first dinners. I was watching. On the 5th evening, she looked at me across the table and said, "You're quiet." I said I listened well. She said, "What have you heard so far?" I thought about it. Said the east fence was going to need a full replacement section where it crossed the creek, not just repair, and that the mayor was anxious at night in a way that might mean something, and that whoever had serviced the north windmill last hadn't tightened the bearing housing all the way, and it would need checking before winter came in hard. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "I'll have Cal check the north windmill." She didn't say anything about the creek fencing or the mare. The next morning I noticed she'd moved the mare to the stall closer to the barn door, which had more airflow, and 2 days after that she told me to plan on replacing a 40-foot section of the creek fence instead of patching it. She'd heard me, she just didn't announce that she'd heard me. The barn at 4 in the morning, the night I couldn't sleep, that was the 11th day. I'd spent a lot of nights sleeping well in that bunk. Ranch work does that. You're tired in the bones by dark and you sleep honest. But that particular night something had me up, nothing I could name, and I'd gone out to the barn the way I do when my mind won't settle, because a barn at night is one of the quieter places there is. The sounds are regular. Breathing, movement in the straw, the occasional shift of weight. Nothing happening, everything alive. I was sitting against the stall boards when Delia came in. She said, "Can't sleep either." And we sat in that barn together and said almost nothing and watched over a mare that wasn't ready yet. Before she left, she said, "He died in March." I think she'd wanted to say it to someone, not because she needed comfort, but because the fact of it was still sitting in her chest with nowhere to go. And the night, and the barn, and the man who didn't talk more than he had to, maybe that was safe enough. I said, "I'm sorry." She looked at me and gave a short nod, same as when the windmill started turning, acknowledging a thing said correctly. She took her lantern and went back to the house. I sat there until morning thinking about a woman who told a near stranger about her father's death in a barn at 4 in the morning, because there was nobody else to tell. The foaling was on the 13th day. Bay filly, good and strong, came in the early hours before dawn with Delia and me working alongside each other without talking, the way you can with someone when the thing you're both doing is more important than words. Delia had done this before, knew her part. I knew mine. We didn't stumble over each other. When it was done and the mare was settled and the filly had figured out her legs, we both sat back against the opposite stall. The filly was at the mare's side. The lantern was burning low. Outside, the sky was starting to pale. Delia looked at the filly for a long time. "My father would have said she's going to be something," she said. I looked at the filly. He'd have been right. We sat there a while longer. One of us would have to go start the morning soon. Neither of us moved yet. Delia said, "How long are you planning to stay?" I'd been asking myself that for 4 or 5 days by then. "Don't know," I said. She looked over at me. "You're useful and you don't talk more than is necessary." She looked back at the filly. "I wouldn't mind if you stayed through spring." That was about as much as Delia Crane offered a person. I'd learned enough by then to know that. I said I'd think about it. She said, "Don't think too long," got up, said good morning the same as she said good night, matter of fact, warm in a practical way, and went to the house. I looked at the filly for a while. I stayed through spring. December came in cold. Not the cold that settles slow, the kind that drops out of a flat gray sky one night and the next morning everything is different. The water trough had ice on it by 6 in the morning, and Ferris complained about it, and Cal told him he'd be complaining about the heat in August same as he always did, and that didn't seem to help Ferris any. The work changed in cold weather. More time on the equipment, more time keeping water moving, making sure the stock had what they needed. Delia added a morning inspection of the north windmill to her routine because the bearing housing I'd mentioned was repaired, but she didn't fully trust it yet, and I offered to take it from her, and she said no. She wanted to understand it herself first. I said that was reasonable. She said, "When I understand something myself, I can catch it when it starts to go wrong again. If I just let someone else handle it, I'm dependent." I thought about that, said, "You ever let anyone handle anything?" She considered, said, "Not since my father." That was the first time she'd offered something unprompted that wasn't about work. I didn't push on it. We were checking fence line along the north pasture when she said it, and we kept walking the fence line, and it sat between us in the cold like a thing placed there carefully. Later that week, she told me about her mother, who'd died when Delia was 19, and about a brother who'd gone east for school and married a woman from Chicago and hadn't come back. She told these things in the same way she told work things, factual, without performing emotion, and I listened the same way I listened to work things, which is to say with actual attention. I'd told almost nothing about myself, not lying, just not offering. She didn't ask and I didn't give. I thought sometimes she must wonder. A man with her employer's eye, she'd have noticed that I knew things a $30 drifter had no particular reason to know. I'd calculated an equipment amortization one evening by memory, just thinking aloud about whether it made more sense to repair or replace the hay wagon, and I saw her look up from what she was doing. But she didn't ask. Delia Crane let a thing be what it was showing itself to be without digging at it. I appreciated that more than I could have explained. January was when I understood I was in serious trouble. By which I mean serious about her. I want to be plain about this because I think people sometimes make it more complicated than it is. I wasn't in trouble in the way a man is sometimes confused about whether he's attached to someone. I wasn't confused. I knew exactly what I was feeling by mid-January. The trouble was what to do with it, given what I hadn't told her. The cold that month was the kind that gets into everything. Into your collar, into the joints of your hands, into the pre-dawn dark when you first step outside, and it hits your face, and you stop for a second like something physical has happened. The kind of cold that makes you appreciate fire and warmth, and being indoors with other people. One of the fence lines along the north pasture went down in a wind. Cal and Ferris were working the south end where 3 steers had gotten through a breach the same night. Different storm. They were having a run of them, So I rode north alone and spent the better part of the day restringing wire in that cold. Gloves were no real help. You can't work wire in heavy gloves. You work it in light ones or bare, and by midday my hands had gone past hurting into just numb and clumsy, which is its own problem. Delia rode out in the afternoon with hot coffee in a jar wrapped in a feed sack. Just rode out an hour each way to bring me hot coffee. She handed it to me and said, "You've been out here since before noon." I hadn't thought she'd noticed. I said, "Fence needed doing." She said, "Drink that while it's hot." I drank it. She sat her horse and we looked out at the pasture. Light snow coming down from a flat gray sky, the kind that's almost nothing, just a feeling in the air. The steers were dark shapes in the middle distance, not concerned about anything. She said, "My father used to say the north fence always wins." I said, "Not today." She looked at me, just for a moment, and then she looked back at the pasture. She took the empty jar, turned her horse, and rode back. I stood there a minute in the cold. The wire in my hand was stiff, and I needed to finish the last section before the light went. But I stood there a minute first. The women who'd known what I was worth, they'd have sent a man with the coffee, or brought it themselves to a thing worth being seen at. Not to a man alone on a fence line in the north pasture where there wasn't anyone to observe it being done. Delia had ridden 2 hours in January cold because I'd been out there since before noon and she thought I ought to have something hot. That's all. No calculation, no audience, just a decent thing done plainly for a man who'd been working in the cold. I hadn't had that, not that I could remember, not where I knew it wasn't about something else. I finished the fence and rode back in the failing light, hands aching where the feeling was coming back, and I thought about what I was going to do about all of this and didn't come to any conclusion. February brought the bank man from Santa Fe. He came out on a Wednesday, younger than I expected and dressed too well for the road. He had a leather satchel and he shook Delia's hand in a perfunctory way, and they sat at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour. I was working on the tack room and I wasn't trying to listen, but the window was cracked and sound carries in cold air when the wind is down. What I could hear was this: the debt was manageable, they'd been making the payments, the bank had no present concerns, but the spring payment was going to be tighter than the others due to the cattle market being off and one of the operational costs having run higher than planned. The bank man was polite about it, the way men are polite when they're actually saying, "Figure it out, because we will not." He left after lunch. Delia saw him out and stood in the yard after his buggy had gone, not watching it go, just standing in the yard with her hands at her sides looking at the middle distance. After a minute, she picked up a fence post that had been leaned against the house wall waiting to be moved, a thing that wanted 2 men to do it comfortably. She moved it by herself across the yard to where it needed to go, setting it down without ceremony, and then she went back in the house. I didn't offer to help. I'd learned that about her. She didn't want help with the things she could manage. What she wanted was for the things she couldn't manage alone to get done without her having to ask twice. That night at dinner she was quieter than usual, not visibly upset, just further inside herself than normal. Cal and Ferris talked about the South pasture and she answered their questions about it, but she wasn't all the way present. I found myself running her numbers in my head afterward, not my numbers, hers. What the debt represented against the land value, what the spring payment required against what the operation would bring in, what the margin was and where it got thin. Running her ledger in my head the way she'd run her feed measurements, not because she'd asked me to, but because I couldn't help it. The margin was thin but not catastrophic. The problem was timing. The cattle market being off meant the timing of income was wrong relative to the timing of the payment. It wasn't a deep hole. It was a cash flow problem, which is a different thing. I looked at the east pasture fence line the next morning. The parcel to the east, 6 years fallow, grass coming in well. I knew the land records of this county the way a man knows them when he's been in the land business long enough that knowing them is habit. The heirs of the man who'd owned it were in Colorado, had been in Colorado for 6 years, hadn't made any move to sell or work it. That parcel, leased for grazing at the going rate, would cover Delia's spring payment with margin left over, and could probably run 10 head comfortably without overworking the grass. There are moments when you know what you're going to do even before you've decided to do it. I knew this was one of them. I told Delia the next morning that the east windmill was pulling to the left, and I thought it needed attention before spring. She said, "Is it bad?" I said, "Not yet, but better to get ahead of it." She said, "Go ahead then." I worked on the east windmill for 3 days. It needed maybe half a day. But I needed the time near the east fence line, looking at that parcel, calculating in my head, planning what I was going to write to Archie Flood and exactly how to say it so my name wouldn't be on the surface of it. On the 3rd day, I wrote the letter, took it to town on my day off, sent it to Archie, explained what I needed him to find out and what I needed him to arrange, without names on the arrangement except his. Archie would understand. He always understood what I was actually asking for under what I appeared to be asking for. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded then. I told myself I was going to leave before she found out who I was. Stay through spring, do good work, let the parcel thing work out quietly if it was going to, and go home to my 4 ranches and my cloud with the dollar sign on it, and have had something real for a few months. I told myself this was fair. I told myself she'd never know the difference. I was lying to myself, which I was aware of even while I was doing it. February into March, and something shifted between us that I am going to try to describe accurately. There were the evenings on the porch. Delia had brought out 2 chairs sometime in January, and after that it became a thing we did, after dinner when the weather wasn't completely hostile. Cal and Ferris stayed in their bunkhouse. It was just the 2 of us, and whatever the sky was doing, which in New Mexico is usually something worth looking at. We'd sit there and not say much. I'd spent enough of my life in rooms where silence was uncomfortable, where people filled it because they were afraid of what it meant. The silence with Delia wasn't like that. It was just 2 people sitting with the dark and the stars and whatever they were thinking about, and neither of them needing to announce it. Sometimes she'd say something. About the land, usually. About what her father had planted in a certain field 30 years ago and why the soil there still ran differently than the soil 50 yards over. About what she wanted to do with the north pasture if she could get ahead of the current constraints. She had a way of talking about the land's future as if it were a living thing with plans of its own that she was trying to figure out rather than impose on. I found that interesting. I'd always thought of land as something you worked. She thought of it as something you were in conversation with. I talked more in those hours than I'd talked in months, which wasn't much, but for me it was. One evening, February, cold but clear, stars down to the horizon, she said, "My brother used to say I was too attached to this place, that I'd made it my whole world." I said he might have been right. She looked at me sideways. I said, "Doesn't mean it was wrong." She was quiet for a bit. Then she said, "My mother used to say the same thing about my father, that he'd given everything to the land and didn't have enough left for people." I said, "You disagree." She thought about it, said, "I think he gave everything to the land and then he gave the land to me, so maybe he had enough left after all." I looked at the sky, said nothing. She said, "Is there something you've given everything to?" I thought about that honestly, said, "Not that's worth being proud of." She looked at me with something I'd come to recognize in the months I'd been there, her way of considering a thing she'd heard before deciding what to do with it. Not judging, just looking at it straight. She said, "That can change." I didn't say anything to that. But I thought about it for a long time after she went in. The night of the Thursday in early March. We were on the porch. The sky was doing something with the last light, going orange and purple in a way that takes your breath away if you've never been in New Mexico and is still remarkable when you have been. And Delia was looking at it with her hands around her coffee cup. She said, without particular emphasis, "I don't know much about you." "No," I said. "I've noticed you don't offer it." "No." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother always said that was a bad sign, a man who doesn't talk about himself." "Might be," I said. "I've decided it isn't," she looked at the sky. "A sign of anything bad, I mean. You work hard and you're straight with me and you're kind to the horses. That's what I can see." She paused. "Whatever else there is, I figure you've got your reasons." I looked at her. She looked at the sky. She said, "I trust you. I want you to know that. I don't say it easy." There was nothing I could say to that was true, so I said nothing. She went inside, said good night the same way she always did. I sat on that porch until the cold was too much and drove me off it, and even then I walked the yard for a while before I went to the barn. She trusted me, and I was keeping something from her that would change everything. I had until morning to decide what to do about it. I told her on a Saturday in March. Not because I'd made a final decision the night before, not because I'd reasoned my way to it cleanly, because she found the letter. It wasn't even dramatic. A letter from Archie Flood had come to the post office in Henley while I was in town for supplies, and I'd picked it up and put it in my coat pocket and forgotten it while I was loading the wagon, and when I got back to the ranch, I'd set it on the shelf in the barn while I was putting away equipment. Just set it there and gone on to the next thing. Delia came in the barn mid-afternoon to check on the filly. The filly was 4 months old by then, getting her own personality, which was considerable. She had her dam's nerve and something extra besides, and she'd gotten in the habit of coming over and pushing her nose against whoever was in the stall, just to make her presence known. Delia was dealing with the filly when she saw the letter on the shelf. You see something that doesn't fit and your eye stops on it. That's all. The letterhead said Bain Land and Cattle, Las Vegas, New Mexico. She'd have known Bain Land and Cattle because it was one of the larger operations in the territory, and people in the cattle business knew the name, even if they didn't know the man behind it. She looked at it, looked at me. I put down what I was working on. I said, "That's mine." She said, "Bain Land and Cattle." Yes. She waited. She was good at waiting. It was one of the things about her. I told her, all of it. I started at the beginning, the 4 ranches, the acreage, the mineral rights, and when they'd started producing, what my life had been like the years before I left. The engagement that ended badly and what I'd understood from it. The 2 years of polite predation and what I'd understood from that. The decision to leave and why, and Archie Flood and the $30, and the work I'd done from Mora County south before I ended up in Henley. The windmill and the bunk, and the 11 days in her barn before she found me awake at 4 in the morning. Then the letter to Archie about the east parcel, what I'd been trying to arrange and why I hadn't said so. I told it flat, no shading, no framing. The way you tell something when you're not sure what you're going to get back, and you've decided not to manage it. I said I was sorry I hadn't told her sooner. I said she had every right to be angry. She stood through all of it without moving. When I stopped, she looked at the letter on the shelf and then looked at me and said, "The parcel to the east." Yes. You were going to arrange the lease and not tell me where it came from. I hadn't fully decided, but something like that. Why? I said, because you were going to lose the spring payment, and I couldn't let that happen, and I didn't know how to explain why I knew what I knew without explaining everything else. She looked at me steadily. That's only part of the answer. It was, she was right. I said, because I wanted to help you without changing what this was, what I was to you. Which was what? I thought about how to say it, said, a man you'd hired because he could fix a windmill, who wasn't worth anything to you except what he could do. She looked at that for a moment, then she said, why would that matter to you? I said, you rode out in January with hot coffee. She looked at me. I said, no reason to do it, no one watching, just because I'd been out in the cold all day and you thought I ought to have something hot. I stopped, started again. I can't tell you the last time someone did something for me that didn't have something else behind it. I didn't want to lose that. Even for a few more months. The filly had gone to the corner of the stall and was watching us. Horses do that when the air changes between people. They pay attention. Delia was quiet for a long time. The barn was quiet with her. Then she said, I didn't know you had money. No. I hired you because you could fix a windmill. Yes. I trusted you because you were straight with me and didn't talk too much, and you knew the mare wasn't ready. I said nothing. She crossed the distance between us. Not fast, not performing it. Just a woman walking towards something she'd made up her mind about. She put her hand against the side of my face. Her palm was rough from work. She looked at me the way you look at something you've been turning over and over and have finally set down. She said, I don't want your money, Walker. I said, I know. But I might want you to stay. I put my hand over hers. Neither of us moved for a while. Outside, the filly in the pasture, she'd been moved out weeks before, growing strong and restless, was calling at something, maybe the wind, maybe nothing. Just her own voice in the afternoon. We stayed like that for a while, no rush, nowhere else to be. I told Archie in April. Sent him a letter that said I'd be another few months at least, and that he should go ahead and formalize the lease arrangement on the east parcel under my name, and that there was a woman named Delia Crane who was going to be running the north operation alongside the lease, and he should treat her word the same as mine. I also told him she didn't know the full size of things yet, and I was going to tell her in my own time. Archie wrote back. He said, "I thought you'd lost your mind when you left. Write me when you've stopped." He also said, "Does she know what you're walking back to?" I wrote back and said, "She knows what she wants to know. Everything else I'll tell her when she asks." She asked in April. We were riding the fence line, the north one, the one that always wins, her father's words, and she said without preamble the way she said most things, "Tell me what 4 ranches looks like." I told her. All of it this time, not just the fact of it, the scale, the operations, what Archie ran and how, the mineral rights and how that income worked, the acreage and how it sat relative to other holdings in the territory. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely asking a question when she didn't understand something, not asking when she did. When I was done, she rode for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "You've been fixing my windmill." "Yes." "You own 200,000 acres. Roughly." She thought about that, said, "Well, nobody told you not to fix windmills." I looked at her. She said, "I mean that." She looked back at the fence line. "A man who'll work for what needs working, that's a man worth having. 200,000 acres doesn't change that." That was Delia Crane. There is something I want to say about that spring, the one between March and June, because it was its own thing and I don't want to skip over it. I'd been on the ranch since November, more than 4 months by then, but March was the first month I was fully there, not a man keeping something back, not calculating when I was going to leave, not holding some part of myself out of it. Just there, working the land, eating at the table, sitting on the porch in the evenings, fully present in a place for the first time in a long while. The spring itself was something. After the hard January and the cold February, the land came back in a way that felt earned. Grass in the north pasture by late March, good green coming up through last year's dry. The creek running clean, which it didn't always do. The filly out in the pasture finding her legs properly, no longer just big and gangly, but starting to move with something like her eventual self in it. Delia worked that spring the way she worked everything, with a plan, worked ahead of the problems rather than behind them. But there was something slightly different about how she worked it. Nothing I could point to exactly. Just that she seemed more at ease inside herself. Less of that quality she'd had when I first arrived, the quality of a woman holding everything up by herself and not letting herself think about how heavy it was. I was carrying some of the weight now. Not taking it from her, she wouldn't have wanted that and wouldn't have let it happen, but alongside her. The way 2 horses on a rig pull the load differently than 1 horse does, not because the load is lighter, but because the effort is distributed and neither one has to be everything. We worked out our way of doing things that spring without a lot of discussion. She knew what she was doing and she could see that I knew what I was doing, and there was very little territory that needed negotiating. When we disagreed about something, the timing on moving cattle from one pasture to another, whether the north windmill bearing should be replaced entirely or reinforced, we said so plainly and worked it through. She was right about as often as I was, maybe more. She knew this particular land in a way I'd need years to match. I noticed the town's opinion of me changed that spring. The few times I went in for supplies, people who'd been politely neutral about the drifter working at the Crane place started being politely warmer. Gaskell at the feed store took to having a coffee ready when I came in, which I think was his version of an apology for the rumors he'd apparently started, though he never said anything directly about it, and I didn't bring it up. The banker's man, not the one from Santa Fe, the local man who managed deposits and such, he nodded to me in the street in a way that had something acknowledging behind it. I didn't say anything about this to Delia. She wouldn't have been interested in the town's opinion either way. But I noticed it because it was different from anything I'd experienced as Walker Bain with the land and the number. Before, people had been differential in a way that had nothing to do with me. Now they were, I don't know how to say it exactly, respectful in a way that meant something. Like they'd seen the man working the Crane place all winter in the cold, and they'd drawn their own conclusions. That was new. One evening in May, we were in the barn after dark, not for any emergency, just finishing up something that had run later than expected. And Delia was checking the filly's hooves, and I was doing something with the tack, and she said without looking up, "My father would have liked you." I thought about that. She said he was suspicious of men who talk too much. He used to say, "A man who tells you about himself before you've had a chance to watch him work, he's selling you something." I said, "And men who don't talk?" He said those were the ones worth watching. I said I wasn't talking because I was keeping something. She said, "I know that now." She ran her thumb along the filly's hoof and set the leg down carefully. "But what I saw while you were keeping it, the working, the watching, the getting up before you needed to, that was real." "Yes," I said. "The rest was just," she paused, "background." She stood up and brushed off her hands and looked at the filly with that particular look she had for things she was satisfied with. "4 ranches," she said, "mineral rights. Archie Flood in Las Vegas running the big show." "Yes." She looked at me. "You know what I think about when I think about you." I said I didn't. "I think about a man sitting against those stall boards at 4 in the morning listening to my mare breathe." She looked back at the filly. "That's who you are to me. The rest is interesting, but that's who you are." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would have added to it. She blew out the lantern and we walked back to the house in the dark, the stars doing what stars do in New Mexico. We were married in June. Delia's 2 hands stood up with us. The judge came out from Henley because Delia said she was not getting married in town for a crowd of people to watch. And the judge was a reasonable man who understood that some people preferred their private things private. He shook her hand when he arrived and she thanked him for making the trip. She brought out coffee and a piece of pie she'd made the day before and told him to eat something before they got started because she didn't want him rushing. He ate the pie. She wore the dark blue dress she wore to church the 2 times a year she went. She didn't carry flowers. Her hair was down, which I'd only seen in the mornings before, dark and going gray at the temples, and she stood at the window in the parlor where the light came in from the east and she looked like herself, which is the only thing I'd ever wanted her to look like. I stood beside her. Cal had his good hat on. Ferris had borrowed somebody's jacket and the sleeves were too long. Neither of them said a word through the whole ceremony. The judge pronounced us married. Delia looked up at me the way she'd looked at me in the barn in March, like a woman who'd made up her mind and was at peace with it, and she was not a woman who made up her mind lightly, and peace was not a thing she wore as performance. It was just there, in the set of her jaw and the stillness of her. I put my hand on her jaw lightly. She reached up and held my wrist, not sentimental about it, just holding, her hand around my wrist the way you hold a thing you intend to keep. The judge cleared his throat. He needed to say something official about papers to sign, I think. And Cal made a noise that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. I found out later she'd known for about 3 days before I told her. Cal had gone to town for supplies and someone at the feed store Gaskell. It turned out the old man who'd sent me to her in the first place had put the name together. Bain, Walker Bain, the drifter who was working out at the Crane place, and Bain Land and Cattle, which wasn't a small outfit. Gaskell had said something to Cal with no particular intention behind it. Just, interesting, isn't it? Men talk. Cal had come home and told Delia quiet, that evening, not sure what she'd want to do with it. She'd sat on it for 3 days. When I asked her why she hadn't said anything in those 3 days, she said, "I was figuring out whether it mattered." I said, "What did you decide?" She was quiet for a moment. We were on the porch. The same 2 chairs, the same angle to the dark. Stars down to the horizon the way they are in New Mexico, which after years never gets ordinary. She said, "I decided it didn't change anything I'd already decided." She'd already decided, before the letter, before the 3 days. The night on the porch when she'd said, "I trust you, I want you to know that," she'd already placed him, Walker Bain, drifter with $30, man who fixed windmills and knew when a mare wasn't ready, as someone she'd made her choice about. The acreage didn't change it. The mineral rights didn't change it. She'd decided on the man. The rest was just details she hadn't gotten around to learning yet. The land is still here. Both pieces of it now, Delia's and the east parcel, running together the way they should have years ago. Archie Flood came up from Las Vegas in the fall to see the place and shook his head in a way that meant he approved. And he and Delia talked ranch for 2 hours straight, while I fixed something on the hay wagon and listened, and didn't need to be in the middle of it. Archie said to me privately before he left, "She knows what she's doing." I said I knew that. He said, "Better than you do, some of it." I said, "Probably, yes." He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "Good," in a tone that was its own kind of endorsement, and then he went home to Las Vegas. Cal is still here. Ferris moved on the following spring, which Delia had seen coming and had started looking for his replacement before he'd said anything. She's like that. She sees things coming and gets ahead of them without making a show of it. The new hand is a quiet man named Ira who has been in the territory long enough to know the land the way it needs to be known, and Delia had him figured out in about 4 days. The filly is 5 years old now. She is something, same as Delia's father would have said. Delia has been working her since she was 2, and the horse has her dam's nerve and something bigger, something that comes from being worked by someone who knows what they're asking and why. Delia and that horse understand each other in the way that happens sometimes between a person and an animal when both of them are paying attention. Some evenings we sit on the porch. The same chairs, the same dark, the same stars that don't quit all the way to the horizon. She doesn't say much most evenings, neither do I. Sometimes she'll say something about the land, what she wants to try in the north pasture, what she noticed about the creek fence, something the east parcel needs that she's been thinking about for a week and has now decided. Sometimes she'll lean against me slightly, the way she does when she's not thinking about it, just settled, and I'll put my arm around her and we'll look at whatever the sky is doing. There was a man once, this was before I left, before Mora County and the fence line and Delia's barn, who told me that what I needed was to find a woman who didn't know what I was worth. I'd thought that was cynical. I'd thought, what a thing to say, what a way to think about people. But what he meant, I think, and what I understand now is this. What I needed was a woman who would find out what I was worth on her own. Not be told, not see a number. Just look at a man fixing a windmill in 40 minutes and decide for herself what she was looking at. That is what Delia Crane did. She saw me sit against the stall boards at 4 in the morning, and she offered the fact of her own sleeplessness like a hand extended. She watched me work. She fed me at her table and talked to me about her father and what the north pasture needed. She rode an hour each way in January cold to bring me hot coffee on a fence line because I'd been out in it since before noon, and she thought I ought to have something hot. She made up her mind about me from all of that, quietly the way she made up her mind about everything. And when she found out the rest of it, the 4 ranches, the mineral rights, the acreage, the name that people in the territory recognized, she considered it the same way she'd considered me standing next to that broken windmill. Looked at it straight. Asked what it meant relative to what she already knew. Decided it didn't change anything. I have been a lot of things in my life. I was a young man who worked hard and built something from not much. I was the owner of an operation that employed good people and kept them employed. I was the man behind a name that other men recognized and factored into their calculations. I was a number in other people's ledgers. I was a cloud with a dollar sign on it. None of those things is what I am to Delia. To Delia, I am the man who sat in her barn at 4 in the morning. The man who knew her mare wasn't ready. The man who fixed the windmill in 40 minutes and the fence in January and the east windmill for 3 days when it needed maybe half a day. Because I needed an excuse to be near the east parcel while I thought about how to help her without explaining why I knew what I knew. The man she walked toward in the barn in March. The man she held by the wrist at the window in June. That's who I am. The rest, the acreage, the operation, Archie Flood, and the Las Vegas office and the mineral rights, all of that is real, and it matters, and I am not pretending otherwise. But it is not who I am to the person who matters most. I've spent time in my life being wanted for what I have, being valued for what I represent, being considered as a number. I understand now the difference between that and being known, actually known, seen, by someone who had no idea what you were worth in any financial sense, and decided for herself that you were worth something. That difference is everything. The land is here. The filly is 5 years old and is going to be something. The north fence mostly wins, but not always. Delia is in the house right now doing what she does on Sunday evenings, running the numbers in her ledger, the columns tight and clear the way her father taught her. In a while she'll come out on the porch, same as always, and we'll sit in the dark and look at the stars and not say much. She'll lean against me slightly, the way she does. I'll put my arm around her. The sky will do what the sky does in New Mexico. I am a man who owns a significant piece of this territory. I'm also a man who can fix a windmill, who knows when a mare isn't ready, who can restring a fence in January cold, and who has a woman beside him who chose the second thing first and kept the rest when it turned out to be there. I am not going to tell you which part matters more. I think you know,